Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm here today with Darren Donovan from the Trade Law School to talk about the NDIS Act and some of the changes that we might be seeing over the next couple of months. Darren, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, George. Lovely to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Darren.
So I'm a supposed expert in administrative law, which is basically the law of bureaucracy and government decisions. So for the last number of years, the NDIS has been a real point of interest for me because it's administrative law that touches so many people's daily lives. 430,000 people who have been given this right, the right to reasonable and necessary supports to pursue their personal goals. And, over the past number of years, we've seen battles over the meaning of that. And today, George, I think we're going to get a chance to talk about the future of that key right and what we might need to do to make sure people are still supported to get those fantastic goals that are put down in those planning meetings supported.
Excellent. Now you're a bit of a law expert, you're a bit of an NDIS nerd, you're everything that we need right now. So I'm really excited that we can speak to you. So late last week, something very interesting happened. A draft of the NDIS legislation, a draft of the changes were leaked, and this has sent us all into a bit of a frenzy. I know I spent my weekend trying to understand it, but I'm not a lawyer. And I want to talk to someone who understands the law. So can you tell us, why is this a big deal? Then also, what do we have to be mindful of while considering what came out last week?
So I think we need to underline that this is just a draft. Now, what we're going to do today, George, I think the best way to approach it is we focus on the draft and the public statements of the agency. So neither of us want to be giving an imbalanced account of where we might be heading. But what's interesting about this draft is it's very clearly not the final draft. So when I look at it, I would say it's not formatted as a bill, which means at best it would be described as a what would this look like draft. So there is that point that we need to make out of fairness to the minister and to the agency. What I would say, though, is so much of this, for those of us who have been tracking the NDIS closely, so much of this matches the public statements of the agency. And in particular, the submission that just went into the independent assessments. Now, why is this a big deal? I think we've only got a limited amount of time in this video, and I want to zoom in on two key issues for families in Australia, for everyone in Australia, actually, even those outside the scheme. The first thing that we know from Senate questions, from Senate submissions, and from this draft is that the government is thinking about changing the right to reasonable and necessary supports based on your goals. That's Section 34. We'll talk about that today. We won't just talk about the fact that it's changing. We might, I think, talk about what might replace it, what the agency has said about what might replace it. But clearly, that is a huge point of departure for the NDIS. That is the core of the scheme that sets up the relationship at the planning meeting. There could be nothing bigger that could be changed. The second thing we'll have time to talk through today is the enormous powers that would be given to a federal minister with this draft. When the NDIS was first created, it was meant to be a collaborative project between the federal governments and the states. And little states like Tasmania and South Australia were given a built-in voice in what would be funded by the scheme, how much would be funded, and as a result, that meant they were protected. The amendments that are bubbling up seem to downgrade the rights of the states and give the federal minister very sweeping powers to define what's in and what's out. And I think that those two things, the right to reasonable and necessary supports and the boundary between the state health systems, the state school systems, and the scheme, those are two issues that we have to talk about that will impact every participant.
Okay, then thank you. Let's talk about the rights of reasonable necessary supports. I was looking at the legislation, and wherever there's a mention of reasonable and necessary, there is a line for it. So they're effectively deleting reasonable and necessary, which is huge, right? That's what we all campaigned for. We campaigned for supports that were necessary, that were reasonable to expect. That's been deleted and replaced with funded supports. Now, what does that mean for people day to day? What will that mean if that gets through?
So the key thing that we need to understand, it's really confronting if anyone has seen the draft to see reasonable and necessary being deleted. Okay, right? That's, that is bound to, that kept us all up late over the weekend. I haven't shaved for that reason, right? Talking to people, discussing it. But it's important to note that the name of your podcast will not change, George, because the plan that the agency has is that the right to reasonable and necessary support to pursue your goals will become a right to a reasonable and necessary budget defined largely off your functional level. Okay, so I want to make sure that we talk about what the government has said as well as the draft. Now, I think the best way to work through this is to talk about what participants currently have in terms of rights. Okay, so currently, you have the right to name your goal, and the agency must engage with you and say, we have to give you the supports to obtain your goal. The agency cannot talk about cost without valuing the benefit of your supports. Okay, so it's where a person names a goal, that's a job, that's education, that's so valuable to Australian society. The law really nudges the agency towards funding it. There's a built-in emphasis on goals and outcomes. And the scheme is centered on asking what's a good investment in the long term. And it's not driven solely by the financial position of the scheme. Okay, the key thing that the right to reasonable and necessary supports gives participants is the right to interrogate the agency. So if we bring it to the human level, right, one of my favorite cases, wins by a person with disability, was a case where the agency tried to give a young man 2,400 in transport funding. Okay, and this is the figure that they typically give to someone who's looking for transport to education. And that young man and his family fought them for 18 months to 2 years. And what he appealed to was his right to reasonable and necessary supports. He said, 2,400 isn't enough. I need to get to the TAFE 3 days a week. My parents can't take me when it's raining because we would have to put my wheelchair in the back of a ute where it would be exposed to the rain. And that case shows us the value of people with disability having the right to demand support for their goals. And what that family did was find the value for money, because the agency's approach would have seen the wheelchair destroyed in the rain. And the government is talking a lot about flexibility, how their new approach, which we'll get to in a minute, how their new approach will be more flexible. but participants need to know the money is sufficient, the funding is sufficient. And the beauty of what the law as it is currently is, we ensure that we fund outcomes. We don't talk about deficits. We don't say you're a level 5 person. You can't do this, you can't do that. We say, what are your goals? And we make sure that the person sitting with the agency is in a position of power. And George, I want to acknowledge, that your experience with the independent assessment, because to me, when we have a scheme centered on goals, every conversation is about the future. It's about what you can do. If we shift the scheme off of goals and onto something else like need deficit model about what people with disability can't do, then everything changes. People have less confidence in their rights. People have less confidence in, whether the agency is on their side. So we don't want to see Section 34 touched because of what it protects: outcomes, investment, listening to the person.
It really puts the person at the center of their plan. It ensures that the person with the disability has their choices recognized, because I often think that, if my goal is to live on my own, with the support that I need to, I guess, live in my own home, the need for support is very different than a person who wants to live with 3 or 4 other people. And that needs to be reflected in the funding, doesn't it? And what I'm thinking, that is possibly what the agency might be. I don't know. It might be trying to give everyone the same amount of funding, regardless of what they actually want to do with their lives. And that's not what we fought for, is it?
No, and I think we should get on to, because, people listening to us will say, oh, they're getting rid, I mean, we don't want to be worrying people. Obviously both you and I are we're looking at these changes and thinking, certainly I am thinking this is not what the NDIS is about. And because it's not personalized, because it's not individual, but what the agency wants to do, and what the minister said after the draft leak, was he gave a commitment, which was the term reasonable and necessary will be in the final draft. Now, as a legal academic, I need to tell people that that commitment is pretty meaningless at law, okay? Because the reasonable and necessary, as we just discussed, isn't a term, it's a right. It's an approach to investing in people with disability. So the reason the minister said the word term is because of the agency's plan. The agency's plan is to shift everything up a level. And what participants will get, according to page 18 of their Senate submission to the Senate inquiry on independent assessments, people will get a reasonable and necessary budget. Okay? So the total amount of funding will be reasonable and necessary. However, in the submission it says the key thing your funding will be calculated off is the function level measured by the independent assessment, which is a static point in time assessment of what's the level of your disability.
Yeah.
And that's the deficit model. Now, if I can just...
But can I just give what the government might say? Government might say to us that, obviously, we need to assess what you're not able to do in order to then provide funding to ensure that you have the funding that you need to do what you need to do. Isn't that effectively what we need from the scheme?
I mean, I think the key thing with the focus on the functional assessment is, as Professor Helen Dickinson and Professor Gemma Carey's two fantastic academics who have full teams working on this. There's never been such an approach to funding where you link a functional assessment to funding decisions, right? So that's a very radical sort of approach. And I think
Is
what
it
we might
really?
like,
Sorry, I thought,
I mean,
isn't that what the TAC does?
from my point of view, the approach, any system of funding should be about what the person is trying to achieve.
Oh, I agree. I agree, Darren, but I'm trying to put forward what the government might say. Couldn't they just say that's what they're trying to do to achieve the removal of the barriers that you experience as a result of your functional impairment?
I mean, so when we look at the idea of overcoming your impairment, okay, that needs to be the focus, not the impairment. So, I think if you think about the way you've expressed that in terms of you want this, we need to know a person's what they're facing in their daily life in order to calculate their supports. Absolutely. But that needs to be married with an emphasis on their potential.
Absolutely.
I do not want people positioned, and like the NDIS is not welfare. And I think in the media, we have to get this clear. The NDIS is as much a piece of investment as building a toll road.
Yes.
Because what the way we approach it now is we do assess people. People have always been assessed, but the assessment is this basic floor on things. We immediately ask, what are your goals? We need to get you the support that you need in the circumstances of your life to overcome this disabling environment that you've been placed into. Like the emphasis on goals also pushes the analysis out into the actual world. So it pushes the analysis out into, here is this person in regional Queensland. The transport infrastructure has not been built historically. The school system has been excluding them. What do they need to overcome that barrier? It's not about about the person. It's about us, all of us in Australia, and the way we've built a society for our convenience, and totally excluded a whole group of people, and we've lost the potential contribution that people with disability can make. So, I think an emphasis on functional levels and categories is fundamentally different from our current goal system. A person can name the outcome, and what we ask is that a good investment? Will that pay off? What will it deliver? We're always looking for the change in the NDIS under the current law. That's the beauty of it, And I think as well that when we have the language of deficit, categorical assumptions, and cost, which is in there as well, George, cost, there's more of an emphasis on the financials of the scheme. It's closer to a private compensation scheme under this draft. We're not talking about goal, outcome, and investment.
And that's the person, right? That's where the person's at the center, and their wishes and what they want to do with their life. I think that's really critical. Let's move on then to your other main area of concern that you mentioned, and that was the change in the power that the Commonwealth, the minister, could have as a result of this change.
So, again, this is slightly, more nerdy, but the implications for people, again, are what we need to focus on. So, when the NDIS was first created, the Act recognized that it was always going to need ongoing gardening. So it was always going to need ongoing maintenance, and we were always going to have to come back, people with disability, advocates, the state governments and the federal governments, we were always going to have to collaborate and add detail to the scheme. So the Act created the NDIS rules and gave the right to the federal government, with the agreement of the states, to manage the scheme using criteria, various, just powers to make sure the scheme functioned. And those powers were shared between the federal government and the states. Okay. And what this draft does, which matches the reporting of Rick Morton in particular on the scheme and the comments of state disability ministers, this new draft concentrates extraordinary powers, what we call in the legal community King Henry VIII powers, in the minister. The federal minister gets extraordinary powers to define what supports will be funded under the scheme, what the eligibility criteria might be, all of these powers that can cut across the Act, add to the Act, limit how the Act applies. All of these extraordinary things are being passed to the minister. And the best example of this for families is the minister in this draft is given the ability to define ordinary living cost. And he basically, it says ordinary living costs will not be funded by the scheme, and ordinary living costs are what the minister says they are. And a really significant development happened on Friday, almost immediately, and that was where both sides of politics in New South Wales, Labour and Liberal, came out and said, this is not the original NDIS design. So Minister Gareth Ward in New South Wales immediately tweeted a letter which said the NDIS is about consensus, bipartisanship, working together between federal and state. If the minister gets this power, George, it effectively imbalances the relationship between the federal and the state governments. It means that the minister of whichever party, I'm not saying whether it's a Liberal or Labour minister in the future, they will have the ability to push costs onto the South Australian justice system, onto the Tasmanian health system, to basically say that's their responsibility. The NDIS only does X, Y, Z. And that is deeply concerning as a matter of governance, in my view. Like, I think when we set up the NDIS, like as Australians, we wanted to stop certain things, George. We wanted to stop bureaucratic assumptions about what people with disability could do. We created Section 34. And we wanted to stop rationing of support and governments arguing with each other and excluding people with disability. Here in this draft, we have a real dangerous concentration of power in the federal government to say, you handle it to the states. And I really think in order to protect the federal budget, they've taken far too aggressive an approach to this entire project. They need to come back to working with people and with the states.
Let me translate this to I guess, more simple way of thinking about it. So if the minister has the power to decide what's an ordinary living expense, does that mean that he could have a list of things that you can't use your funding for, based on what the minister feels that he or she doesn't want to pay for? So, for example, it could be things that might relate to your disability, and because of your disability, you have a need to spend more on that particular living expense. Because, cleaning, for example, you could say keeping your house clean is an ordinary living expense, but if you can't do it yourself, it becomes a disability need.
So that's I think the best way to to do this, the fairest way to do this, is to talk about what the agency has argued in the tribunal. So for the last couple of years, lawyers have had to fight off agency attempts to push things out of the scheme. And the agency has tried to argue the following things were a day-to-day living expense, and they've lost, okay? But with this new power, I think these are good examples of what we need to watch for and why this new power is not healthy. So let's take a few cases. Milburn versus the National Disability Insurance Agency. There, the tribunal found people with disability are entitled to gym membership, to have that funded, because it relates to the management of their disability. As you say, it directly relates to their disability. The agency fought that person for 2 years. Second example, a man with MS up in Mackay in North Queensland. He needs air conditioning to manage his temperature, or his disability will be aggravated. Agency fought him for 2 years, saying everyone in Mackay buys air conditioning. You're no different. Pay for it out of your own funds. And the tribunal, using the current law, said, no, you're wrong to the agency. You're wrong. It's not a day-to-day living cost because it relates directly and solely to the person's disability. So from my point of view, I am looking at this power and saying, why do they want to change what we currently have? Why do they want this power? Now, I'm not saying they're going to kick air conditioning and gym membership off. What I'm saying is the reason I'm worried about this power is they tried previously to argue those aren't covered. I don't want to panic people, but this is why we watch government powers. Because for the last 8 years, lawyers have seen how the agency would like the scheme to run, and Section 34 has stopped them cookie cutting plans, and the power of the states has stopped them pushing legitimate disability related expenses out of the scheme. Transport is a biggie too. There's been such a long running war over transport. The agency has in the past argued that some trips that people with disability take are lifestyle choices and not disability related. All of that, has been fought by lawyers losing the law. If the law changes, lawyers don't have the same arguments, and the agency may be able to stand up more restrictions.
It sounds like these changes are things that we do need to look at very carefully. We know that this is just a draft of the legislation. We haven't seen the final legislation, and we will quite soon. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to listeners and families listening about what might be coming?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the draft, when it comes, will be a whole lot more subtle. Okay, so there will actually be more technicality in the draft, and it will not be, I don't think we should approach this draft and say, when it eventually comes out, the government proposal, we need to forget about this draft, because I think the government would be happy if we all went and said, phew, at least it isn't that draft that got leaked. Because I want to underline to families that they are in a strong legal position right now in terms of that right that Section 34 gives them. I think, having seen lawyers and advocates work in the tribunal, Section 34 protects people with disability from a certain type of mindset. And that mindset is a private insurer's mindset that says, how much are you going to cost us over your lifetime? Let's look at the actuaries' tables. The way Section 34 is drafted, as we've sort of covered, it makes sure that we always look at the benefits of supporting a family, the carer that goes out into the workforce, the value of the contribution people with disability can make in the workplace. sometimes the agency looks at its internal balance sheet and it doesn't count the savings in the health system. It doesn't count the savings in the justice system. It doesn't count the achievements of people with disability. If we're too much like a private insurance company, we will lose the NDIS, because the NDIS was about Australians coming together and saying, let's stop being stupid in our relationship with people with disability. Let's focus on asking, what can support achieve? Let's not focus on measuring, what they can't do. Every day, push for outcome. And I just want to encourage, my fear is that there's a lot of people very tired right now in the disability sector, with the Royal Commission, with the independent assessments. Now there's this draft act that's really confronting. I think we all need to come back to the achievement of 2013 and to remind the public, remind the politicians, this scheme pays for itself over the long run. Every dollar in this scheme passes a value for money test. This scheme has the potential to change Australia. The agency, in its defense of its budget, doesn't have a right to lose those to put in, to sort of save pennies and we lose dollars, if I mix currency. But to me, I think we need to come back to what was fought for. And you know that best, George. I mean, I know I sound like a lecturer because that's my job. But remember to be positive and to talk about achievements, because this is a fantastic scheme. And we just need to tighten some things up, but we don't need to do the things this draft does.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that the message that we want to end on is that we want the government to stay true to what the NDIS was always meant to be, and that was about the person being at the centre and living an ordinary life in the community. And we're really, really hopeful that the government does listen to people with disabilities and take the time to stop and consult better than what we've seen so far. We accept that there are some changes that could make the NDIS fairer and more accessible, and we want to be a part of those. What we don't want to be a part of is pulling apart the NDIS into something that is not what we asked for. Thanks for joining us, Darren.
Thanks, George. Thank you.